So good morning. My name is Kurt Paulsen. I'm a professor of urban planning here at UW-Madison. And you'll hear later from Mark Elsden. And I had a great opportunity to be author of one of the chapters in his forthcoming book, so ask him about his forthcoming book. And as a disclaimer, I will say I see a number of students, former students, and friends in the audience, so you may have heard this talk before, so get your tomatoes ready or whatever. The other issue is we have an hour, and if I talk to the whole hour, I'm going to be bored, and so are you. Of course. It's that time of year, right? So if you have questions or discussion points as we go, we have a microphone. So you feel free to raise your hand and ask questions as we go. So we'll make it more interactive. And do remember, if you're going to ask a question, to wait for the microphone, because then people on the live stream can hear it. Otherwise, they can't hear you. All right? And the other disclaimer, or kind of administrative detail, is my slides always have a lot of data and information. And they may be hard to see. So the point is to tell a story. These will all be available on either the website or emailed out to you, or you can email me. So don't get lost in the details, because you invite a professor, you get lots of data and charts. Oh, hi. Hi, Julie. It's like, sorry, you've heard this talk many times before. So lots of diverse people here from the city, from nonprofit developers. So I'm really hoping that this is a productive day for all of you in your conversation. So there we go. My slides are working, and the microphone is working, and hopefully my voice keeps working, and then we can get started. So I give some version of this talk around the state because obviously we have a huge housing crisis, and the truth is we don't have one housing crisis, we have at least 4 housing crises. They overlap, they intersect, they're all related, because all housing markets are related to each other. But I still think it's helpful to think of them as kind of somewhat distinct concepts because they might yield different public policies. And most of the reason I'm saying this is most of my discussions, most of my presentations are for a public policy audience, a generic public audience, where we can't make some of our values comments explicit, right, and be explicitly normative. So since this is a faith-based housing summit, we can start the day with a good word, right, and there's plenty of source material for those of us who are of a religious faith that tells us that care for the poor, solidarity with the poor, establishment of justice are kind of a big deal, right? Because all humans are created in the image of God, so poverty, violence, oppression rob people of that God-given dignity. So there it is. Is this not the fast that I choose to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin, right? I'm not sure that would be a verse that would be quoted frequently in city council meetings or in the legislature. But I think for those of us from a faith perspective, right, this is kind of marching orders, right? Food, shelter, clothing, kind of the basic necessities of life. Or if you prefer, that is also Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I bring this up here because people always say, housing is a human right. And then people say, well, why do you say housing is a human right? Well, literally the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that adequate housing is part of a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being. Okay, so let's get into the data and the survey and the questions that all of you are asking about the state of Wisconsin. And so since I'm a professor and this is early morning, we'll start with a little quiz. A little homework, and where's, like, my former students, Deacon, right? They're going to warn you. If professor asks a question, it's a trick. It's a trap. So I want you to think about this in your mind, about thinking about housing prices and rents in your region. Most of you are from Madison, so let's say Madison, Dane County. In the next 10 years, adjusting for inflation, do you want housing prices and rents to be higher than they are today, about the same, or lower than they are today? So think about that for a minute. Then we're going to do a little vote. That's my excuse to grab more coffee. Okay, how many say that you want housing prices and rents to be higher than they are today? Okay? How many of you want them to be about the same? And how many of you want them to be lower than they are today? Okay? So why is this a trick question? This is a trick question because very few of you are elected officials. And if you ask elected officials, what they will tell you is that they probably want housing prices to be lower because that improves affordability. But it's the incumbent property owners, both owners and owners of rental apartments, who don't want housing to be less expensive. They want it to be more expensive. So I always use this question as a thought exercise in my class because it's the conundrum that everybody cares about, which is the price of housing. But we have no fundamental social agreement about what that price should be. Maybe this is why I'm not an elected official, and when I ran for office I lost, because, what's the correct answer to this question? I would say that we want housing prices to be lower than they are today, so that they're more affordable, right? And that's part of what we're talking about. Okay, so here's another way to think about it, right? Professors are always trying to think of different ways to explain complex topics. So I don't know if this works for you, but this is 4 puzzle pieces. When we talk about housing affordability, we're talking about housing demand and housing supply. And we'll talk today about how those forces interact and why that structures the way that housing markets work in Madison, Dane County, and then the rest of the state. So on the demand side, we have households and we have income. What drives housing demand? It's demographics and jobs. So one of the questions is, why is housing so expensive in Madison? And one of the answers is, we generate a lot of jobs. A lot of people are moving here for good jobs at good wages. So that's a good problem to have, in the sense that that's a better problem to try to solve than the opposite problem, where people and jobs are leaving a region. But it means that we face challenges, right? Because the demand for housing exceeds the supply. And then on the supply side, you have the types of units that are available in the market and the prices that they're available to. So we're going to start first by just laying the landscape of housing demand. And I realize when we talk about kind of moral issues in terms of faith-based housing summit, jumping into demographics and income and housing demand is like uninspiring, right? But I think we have to set the table in terms of what are the issues that you all are going to deal with. So in terms of households, we're talking about the number and size of households, the type, and then people with special needs, whether it's people with disabilities, people with children, all sorts of different ways that are not being met by our current housing system. Okay, here's a slide that, of course, in the small print you can't read, so I'm going to tell you the highlights. And this will all be available, right? But if you think about one of the challenges we face in Wisconsin, and we face this more acutely in Dane County, but it's the same sort of challenge, is that we are adding population, we are adding households, we are adding jobs, and we're adding income. All of these are generally considered good things. We are growing. We're growing slowly compared to coastal metros, but we are growing. But we are adding jobs at a rate that is faster than we are adding households. And we're adding households at a rate that is faster than housing units. This is the story in the state. This is also the story in Dane County. You look around, you see Dane County's added thousands and thousands of housing units in the past 10 years. And now I'm here to tell you that it's not enough, right? And so what that means is that the rate of growth of households, who are people who occupy housing units, is faster than the rate of housing units. So what that means is that your vacancies are going down and prices are going up because it's more competition for scarce available units. Okay? So that's the kind of demographic driver of housing demand, households, jobs, income, unless you want to say that we don't want people to move here and we don't want companies to create jobs, right? Both of which would be bad things to say, probably. And certainly not very popular things to say. You're going to have housing affordability challenges unless you can build enough units in the range and price points that people want to accommodate demand. Okay? The other key point is that rents have really accelerated in the last 2 years, and we'll talk a lot about why rents have accelerated in the past 2 years. Other key point, both for Dane County and for the state of Wisconsin, is that our fastest rate of growth of income is for renter income, not homeowner income. And that seems weird, right? And one of the things we know from looking at the data is that there are thousands of households that, given the choice, would prefer to be homeowners rather than renters. But because they can't afford the units at the price point they want in the location they want, or the units just aren't available, they stay in the rental market and put pressure on the rental market. So for those of us who study housing markets, all housing submarkets are interlinked, right? Because if someone moves here at a high income level and they can't find the housing unit that they would want, they're going to take the next available unit, right? And push that through thousands of times in a system, and it means that the people with the lowest income, the most vulnerable households, are either living way far away, because that's the only house they can afford, or they're paying more than 50% of their income in rent, or in the most extreme cases, they're doubled up or they experience homelessness. Right? So I want to be clear about where I'm going. If we don't have enough housing supply, we will always have an affordability problem. But just having an adequate supply doesn't solve your affordability problem, right? It lowers the prices, it creates more opportunities for people to live in different places and neighborhoods and choices. But for people of a low to modest income, you're almost never going to create enough housing to make it affordable, right? And that's why we really have kind of a two-pronged approach to thinking about housing affordability and affordable housing. Okay. Are you bored yet? Because I'm going to keep doing slides. Okay. Wisconsin is very similar to Dane County. Fastest rate of growing households are 1 and 2 person households, right? Family households are shrinking in size, and this is both long-term demographics as people have fewer children, but also that we are attractors of young people. And so one of the things this tells me is our standard housing product around the state is the 3 or 4 bedroom, small to medium-sized housing lot, a single-family detached house. And that is not meeting the needs of most of the households we have, right? And at least Madison is a lot easier, but in most cities in the state, if you wanted to build apartments, for example, that really focused on one-person households, right, you're going to get a lot of pushback from the neighbors about, you know, transients and renters and that kind of language. But, okay, this is why then I always ask this question. Who's ever lived in a rental place? Right? So you're basically saying we don't want you, right? I lived in a rental when I was young and in graduate school, right? Then I'll probably live in a rental or a 1-bedroom when I'm old and the kids leave, right? I mean, as we move through the lifestyle cycle, as we move through stages of life, you need a diverse supply of housing, not just price points, but sizes, locations, right? Was there a question? Someone have a question? Okay, so, and changes by age, right? If you want the shorthand for Wisconsin's demographics, I'm sorry to do this to you, we're old and we're cold. This is a huge challenge if you read anybody in the workforce literature, right? Which is that we are going to be an aging state, and this is a good thing, right? Because the alternative to aging a year, every year, we say in demographics, every year everybody gets a year older, except if you're dead, right? So people are living longer, they're staying in their housing longer, but what that means is we're going to have greater service needs, greater needs for people in various medical and care and transportation, but an inadequate supply of workers to meet that demand. right? And we, as a state, are competing with every other state to attract younger workers. Now, you're all thinking there's some solutions to this which might not be politically popular, right? But here's where, again, I think a faith justice view would say, you know, there's two sources of additional labor force that we're kind of excluding, right? We could stop sending so many people to prison. And there's immigration, right? And so this is the conversation we're going to have as a state, right? Because you just look at the demographics, the number of young people available to kind of fill those workforce jobs in the next 20 years is declining. And so here's another way to think about it, is you put the population in terms of age and the number of people, right? So baby boomers are living longer, they're staying in their houses longer. This is a good thing, right? But in terms of accessible transportation and other sorts of care in the home, if people want to age in place, it's a huge challenge, particularly outside of Dane County and in the northern counties of this state. There's no workers to help take care of people in their homes, right? And then the millennials are the largest generation ever in American history. And they're all at peak home buying age, right? And so this is where in any normal time in American history, as if there's ever was a normal time, they would all be buying homes. But they're not buying homes. Because either the homes are too expensive, they have student loan debt, or the homes just aren't available at a price point they want, okay? So in many ways, the millennials have been hit twice by both the 2008 housing and financial crisis and then COVID and the run-up in housing prices in the last couple of years, okay? So if you, I'm just gonna skip this because this is Wisconsin. Dane County is growing super fast. Everybody else is growing kind of slow, except for many of our rural counties that are decreasing in population. So even within the state, we have populations that are reallocating themselves. And I talk all the time to leaders and legislators from rural areas, and they're like, we're really experiencing a workforce shortage. People are leaving rural areas to seek opportunities, and no housing is being built in rural areas. So I do want to make the point that when we think of affordable housing, housing supply, all of these issues you're all interested in, it's not just hardcore urban areas, suburban job centers. It's also rural areas and small towns. And as anyone who's worked in that field can tell you, it's just a lot harder and more complicated to build 6 units of housing in a rural area than to build 60 units of housing in Madison. Okay, so let's talk a little bit on the supply side. Again, you can't read this slide, so I'm going to tell you the story, right? And I love this slide because we say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and a good data table is worth 1,000 pictures. So we used to build a lot of housing. That's from pre-crisis. Everything went up, right? So the orange line is single-family building permits in the state. The blue line is lots that are created by subdivision, because unless you create a lot, you can't build a house on it. And the green line is multifamily building permits. So we used to build a lot of housing in the state. The housing and financial crisis hit. We probably overbuilt in 2006, 2007, 2008. But then the main story is for the last 15 years, we've been underbuilding housing. There's a lot of complex reasons why. But one of the reasons why we're seeing real price points and pressure points in all of our housing markets is that we've just underbuilt housing for the last 15 years. If you want the data, we used to build about 6.7 units per 1,000 population. Okay, if you're wondering, kind of a housing economist's kind of one data point that tells you housing supply, it's building permits per 1,000 people. We used to build about 6.7. Now we're building under 4 per 1,000 people, right? So more than for most of this last decade, we were less than half of our historic production, right? Again, a data table you can look at later, right? One of the things we have to point out is that Dane County has the largest housing supply gap anywhere in the state, right? Over the last 11 years, last 15 years, we've added 57,000 households. Okay? As you can tell, right? Every place is growing, every place is booming in Dane County. But we've only added 46,000 housing units, right? Which means we're 11,000 housing units short, right? So even when we talk about the future, about all the units we need to build to accommodate all the job and population growth we see coming, we still have this huge gap. And again, I don't know if you like this joke or not, but I like to call this the reverse field of dreams. If you don't build it, they still will come. People are coming here whether we want them or not. And just to be clear, we should want people, right? Being welcoming of new people is a good thing, right? And our companies are successful. They're creating jobs at a pretty fast rate. That means people are going to move here, right? At least for us in Dane County, there's 100,000 people who are listed as being employed in Dane County and don't live in Dane County. And one of the things we have to think about as a region is when we talk about where is the affordable housing for ownership in Dane County, the answer is it's in Jefferson County. It's in Janesville, it's in Beloit, it's in Beaver Dam, it's in Sauk, right? And so, okay, I'm going to start preaching now, right? If more people want to live in your neighborhood than there's current housing, and the homeowners in the neighborhood say, no, we don't want more housing, it's not like that housing magically disappears. It gets built somewhere and those people still come. And you're basically saying if we don't want high-density infill housing near jobs and transit, we're saying people have to live far away and drive all the time. Right? So, can I get an amen, Justice? Yeah. I see Justice in the back. You want someone to preach, you bring Justice up here. Anyway, maybe I'll do this. We used to build more than the national average of housing in Wisconsin. The red line is Wisconsin for the Badger State, right? We used to build more on a per capita basis. This is one of the reasons why, in relative terms, housing in Wisconsin is affordable. And people are moving here from the coast just because those markets are unaffordable. And actually, I'm convinced that over the next 50 years, we're going to see a lot of climate migrants coming back from Arizona and Florida, right? But for the last 15 years, we've underbuilt housing relative to our historic levels. What that means is that we have an aging housing stock. So earlier I talked about 4 housing crises interrelated. This is one of our crises. Most people, even if we start building tons of new housing, in any given year, 99% of people live in used housing. I know we don't like to use the term used housing, but housing that's already been built for longer than a year. As our housing gets older, there's increasing needs just for repair, modernization, upkeep, energy efficiency, accommodation for people with limited mobility, all of these issues. You can talk to Andy Height, who helps run the state's emergency housing assistance programs. And that's, right? I can't even describe the volume of calls they get around the state of people whose the furnace doesn't work or the roof needs repair, right? And these are senior citizens on fixed income and with property taxes and utilities and repairs. That uses up their entire budget, so there's no money for medicine or travel or other sorts of things. And so I guess from a public policy perspective, we don't have a good home repair program in this state. And there's not very much money at all. Now, in places around the state where you do see some effort, it is volunteer and charity-based groups like Habitat for Humanity, right? And we can talk later, and I know a lot of your discussions will be about, is the response to these advocacy for changes in public policy or more generous collaborative partnerships for churches and synagogues and religious groups to kind of fill that gap, right? And the answer is both, right? But we have a lot of older housing. And I put this slide up just because, when I speak to diverse audiences, there are a lot of people who don't really care about housing, don't think much about housing, but they think about jobs and economic development. And so our largest job center counties, Waukesha, Brown, Dane, Outagamie is Appleton, right? Have a lot more jobs than they have housing. So we just need to tell this truth and make it simple. Where do people want to live? They generally want to live near where they work. Jobs and schools, right? And we've just made it very difficult to build more housing near jobs and good schools where people want to live, right? And that's why one way to think about at least part of our crisis is we need to build more housing where people want to live. But the people already living there don't want more housing to be built, right? That alone won't solve the issue that low-income renters can't afford a decent place to live. So even if we drastically increased housing supply, we would also need to increase rental assistance and affordability funding. Waukesha County is on my mind because there was just a story, I think I'll get in trouble. This is being live streamed, so I'm going to say it. There was just a story the other day of an alderperson, elected alderperson in the city of Brookfield. And a developer wanted to build housing at the 60 to 80% AMI range, which in Dane County would be like 50,000 to 70,000. So we're talking teachers, nurses, firefighters. We're talking people who work in Brookfield. And he basically said, we shouldn't build this housing because people need to earn their way up into Brookfield. And if we allow low-income housing, then we're just going to become like Wauwatosa. But I think this attitude is actually more prevalent in a lot of people's minds, all over, you know, even in Madison, right? And the whole point is, if you're going to take jobs, right? Waukesha County has the highest jobs housing gap. If you're going to take jobs, you should take housing. It should just be kind of a rule of thumb for local elected officials that says, if we're going to take the economic development that comes with job-based activities, we need to take the housing that goes along with it. Okay. That's kind of getting to be like a sermon, right? I mean, part of the challenge is places that have high housing prices, rents or home ownership. The prices are high because people want to live there, right? There's huge demand for housing in neighborhoods that have high amenities, near parks, near schools, near transit, near jobs. And so if we say, I'm kind of preaching to the Madison crowd, right? If we say every neighborhood is full, we can't take more housing, right? We're kind of saying a similar thing, which is we don't want more people to take what we already have, which is our neighborhood quality and our schools, right? And that's the tension, I think, for a lot of us, which is, you know, for those of us who live in Dane County, we have an extremely high quality of life. This is a nice place. I mean, we could do without the snow and the cold. But that's probably the only negative in terms of quality of life. I know some of you love outdoor recreation. I'm getting a little old. So, you know. We've got good jobs, we've got good schools, we've got reasonably affordable quality of cost of living relative to other places in the country. So a lot of people are going to move here. A lot of people want to move here. The forecast is between now and 2050, we need to accommodate at least 75,000 new housing units. I think that's an undercount. So that's why we're doing this regional housing strategy, which is where are we going to put all these houses? Right? Where are we going to put all these people? Yes. Can we get a microphone?
I'm going to embarrass myself now. I live in University Heights, and they definitely want to make that more dense housing, but how do you do that if the space is already filled up? And if you make the houses hold more people, and you don't have the person who owns the house live there, the quality is going to go down because who's going to move in that area are all students. So I just don't know how you put more houses in there, where they're already filled up space. You know, I really would like more density, but I don't understand how you do that.
tied to that, I would ask whether it's true that we don't want more housing in our neighborhoods, or if it's that we don't want more dense housing. Because I look around and I see lots and lots of single-family houses going up, and many of them, they're very expensive.
Yep.
That is not, there seems to be a question here about owned housing versus rental housing that I think remains an open question in what you've talked about and how that works.
So, let me step back for a minute to a larger question, which is I want to ask people who lives in subsidized housing here. I live in subsidized housing. What's the largest, Justice, you can't answer, my former students can't answer. What's the largest federal housing program in terms of households served and money spent? It's the tax incentives for homeownership. We spend a lot more in this country subsidizing white homeowners with adjusted gross income over 100,000, meaning you make enough to itemize, than we do for low-income rentals, right? That's been our housing policy for about 100 years. So I'm going to say something that sounds radical, and it doesn't, I can't give you the whole reason why I got here. I mean, it takes a long time, but I don't think housing policy should prefer one tenure over another. In most European countries, if you, like in Germany, if you own a house, it costs you more to live in it than to rent it out, right? And so I think one hears a lot of rhetoric about homeownership, and generally homeownership is good. But homeownership is heavily subsidized indirectly. And so when you hear people generally speak in favor, I go to so many city council meetings and plan commissions all around the state, right? You hear that we prefer home ownership, right, to rental. And it's a bit of a fallacy to say home ownership is better, because home ownership is heavily subsidized. And it's not as if that the reason someone is a homeowner, well, let me step back out of that sentence. Generally, homeowners tend to be older, wider, and have more income. And so one of the things that the research tells us is that who participates in city council and plan commission meetings to oppose new development, these people are overwhelmingly older, wider, richer, and homeownery. More homeowners, right? And at one level, it's totally understandable, right? It's your single largest asset. It's undiversifiable. And so you have a deep incentive to kind of monitor neighborhood quality, parking, traffic, density, and the like, right? But it's, on the other hand, it's kind of a misnomer. It's not as if it's my own virtue, effort, and merit that caused me to become a homeowner, right? I'm a homeowner largely because the bank of mom and dad, right? That's where a lot of people arrive, right? And here's where then I step back and I say, I grew up in a 1940s FHA house that had a racially restricted covenant. So I'm going to show you slides in a minute about homeownership disparities by race. So I'll acknowledge it's a very complicated question, because people who are already in a home and they own it, of course they think that if the neighborhood changes in some way, that's negative towards their quality of life and their property values. So that's one side of the equation, and I'm not trying to dismiss that, right? I'm thinking more in the macro sense. If we need to add more housing units and more people, and we can't do it in established neighborhoods, then it has to go on the outskirts of the city, right? Cities either grow up or they grow out, right? Grow up in both senses of the word, right? So it's going to be a real conflict, right? And of course, what adds to the complexity is that student rental housing is a current issue before the Madison City Council. And I have some thoughts on that as a professor. Right, because one of the challenges for us in Madison is lots of people want to live in the downtown and near downtown area. Student enrollment has increased at UW-Madison. We think that's a good thing. All right. We are only allowed to build X number of dorm spaces by the state budget. So here's where I say, if you want to convince the legislature to allow us to build more dormitories, we'd be glad to build more dormitories. Right? But we have no dormitory space, so people are in rental housing. But lots of young people who work at Epic or are coming here also want to live downtown. Right? So that just puts a lot of pressure on housing markets. You can see it in a microcosm in Madison in the downtown area, and then kind of a macrocosm around the state. If 100 people want to live in an area, and there's only 95 housing units, somebody's not going to be able to live there. Right? And usually it's the lowest income folks who are pushed out. So I guess I would say, in a city as large and diverse as Madison, every neighborhood should do its kind of fair share of a variety of housing types. And that's really hard to say in these historic neighborhoods, right, where there doesn't seem to be much room for any new housing. So I did not completely solve that issue, right? This is why housing is such a struggle and such a fight, right? Because it's not like we can easily create a kind of Manichaean morality play of good versus bad. It's, maintaining the stability and quality of neighborhoods where people live and have invested and have expectations is a good thing. Welcoming a more diverse new population is also a good thing, and those seem to be in deep tension. So the other challenge for us as planners is, if the fight is over this particular development in this particular neighborhood, right, and that's the way we do it, it's always this fight over this development in this neighborhood, then we do miss the larger conversation of how are we going to build 75,000 new housing units in Dane County in the next 30 years. I'm going to keep moving on, but this is the tension, yeah, and I hope you hear from me that there's a kind of ambiguity and tension about these issues. Okay, it's really hard to build new stuff. That's part of the other story. Banks are tightening up lending for construction. And so ask all your finance questions for Don Bernards and he'll tell you it's expensive and you can't get access to capital. And here's where I would say that the public sector commitment to building housing is pretty limited because the resources are limited. I know people at the city who would love to spend more money to build more affordable housing. They don't have the money. And the federal government's commitment has declined, right? We can talk about that. So the private sector builds housing. And they only build housing if they can get adequate capital and a return on capital. But right now, capital is really expensive because interest rates are high. And so that means that construction costs are also high. So here's where I say something very unpopular, but as a housing economist, I have to say it. Okay. What's happened to the price of used cars in the last 2 years? Used cars have gone up because it's really expensive to build new cars, and they can't build new cars. It turns out the closest substitute for a new car is a used car. And the closest substitute for a used car is a new car. Right? Same with housing. It takes longer for prices to adjust because it takes 3 years. Right? If I went out today and I said I want to develop property, it's going to be 3 years at least before it's occupied. But construction costs have gone up 35% in the last 2 years. So one of the reasons why housing costs have gone up tremendously in the last 2 years is the cost of building new stuff has also gone up. That's unpopular, right? Because we want to tell a story of it's some conspiracy or investors or greed or something. And that might be part of it in submarkets, but mostly it's construction costs and interest rates. Right? So, right, we talk about thousands of potential homeowners in Dane County who would love to be able to buy something in the $300,000 to $350,000 price range. You can't even build a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 1,000-square-foot house for that anymore. Right? So these issues are going to continue to press on us. House prices are up 33%. So here's where we stop, and here's where I say, this is not a problem. I'm very happy about this, because guess what? My house has gone way up in value. So, and I refinanced at 2.875% during the pandemic, right? So this is also one of the problems. People like me aren't moving. We're not going to move. You can't afford to move because your mortgage is cheap, right? Which is good. You want people to stay in their housing, but it doesn't recycle that housing for younger families because I'm right near elementary school, right? And pretty soon I'm just going to be an old person sitting there. So I'm very cognizant of the fact that when I forecast aging, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's me. Okay, during the pandemic, house prices skyrocketed. So in Dane County, our median sales price went up $87,000 in the last 3 years. Whose income has gone up $87,000? And one of the reasons we think it's construction costs and interest rates is it's not just high demand counties like Milwaukee, Dane, Waukesha, and Brown. It's also places like Eau Claire and Fond du Lac and La Crosse, which didn't have a lot of demand increase. Okay? Mortgages are expensive now, right? And this is where when you talk to young people, they're very distressed. Because the thing I want to buy, that entry-level housing product, is much more expensive. And the dollars I have go less far because interest rates are high. And so it's the double whammy that faces young people. It's actually a triple whammy because with rents going up, it's harder to save for a down payment. All right? Now you can make the argument that mortgages aren't skyrocketing, they're just returning to normal. And we had a 15-year period of arbitrarily cheap credit. Okay, so housing affordability, this is where we really want to get to. Okay, again, it's hard for you to see the slide. Vacancy rates have gone way down. So in Wisconsin, the homeowner vacancy rate is less than 0.5%. In a normal market, it fluctuates between 1% and 2%. Right? When you have inadequate supply and huge housing demand, you have more people chasing fewer housing units. Prices go up, vacancies go down. Same with rental vacancies. One of the things this means is that landlords get really choosy. And all of you, especially if you are working with people who have perhaps a past criminal conviction or an eviction on the record, right? I know a lot of people in here are doing services. Landlords are like, no, I'm not going to rent to you. Or you need to show me that you have 3 times the income, the rent and income, right? So as vacancies go down and prices go up, it's particularly hard on the most vulnerable, right? And that includes families with kids. Because let's be honest, this happens in Madison too, not just in Waukesha County, but landlords will choose between a family that has young kids and a family that doesn't have young kids, right? It's a violation of the Fair Housing Act, by the way, to say, no, I don't rent to families. But they do it, right? Because if you have huge demand and limited supply, as a landlord, it makes sense to be more choosy, right? Choose someone who's not going to put more stress on the unit and is more likely to pay. What that means is that our most vulnerable populations are much harder to house, right? Here's where I'm going to step back and again, ask a professor question. Dane County versus Milwaukee County, which has a higher poverty rate? Milwaukee County. Which has a higher homelessness rate? Dane County. Right? Because the main cause of homelessness is not poverty. It's housing affordability. Right? And there's just more units to put people into in Milwaukee County. Right? And anyone, I'm with Pastor Allen of Zion Church, right? And we're leading this delegation for United Way looking at their homeless services. Right? And the issue is, even if you had robust funding and a voucher to put someone in a unit, there's just no units available to put people in. And that's where I do think that one of the purposes of the summit is for faith-based organizations to say, we can create an alternative that's kind of outside of the system, you know, not just mission-driven nonprofits, but mission-first nonprofits. So there's a great case where there's a church in Eau Claire that had like a wing of their church they no longer use as old Sunday school classroom space. And they're converting it into 16 apartments for people at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness, right? And so this is kind of the macro structure, is that prices are up, affordability is down, and that hurts the people at the bottom the most. And that's the squeeze. Okay. Housing affordability in Wisconsin has declined everywhere. That's the same story. Again, you can't see this. Madison used to be affordable. That is that the median price of a home relative to median income used to be below 3. It's well above 4 right now, which means we've just become an unaffordable region. Okay, I want to make sure to get to this and then we can have some more. I'm sorry, I think someone had a question over there and I totally moved on. Can we?
Sorry, it wasn't a question as much as it was a comment when you were talking about the landlords in Milwaukee and whether somebody had eviction or hardships. There are also landlords that will, they're being preyed upon. So there's landlords that will rent to you if you have an eviction or a hardship, but they're going to get a triple security deposit.
Yep.
And they're not in the business of ever giving security deposits back.
Right. So let's talk about that. So a lot of mission-driven nonprofits or mission-first churches will either sign what's called a master lease. So you're looking for a willing landlord, right? And they're in shorter supply because they can get, right? A landlord has to pay their bills too. I know we don't like landlords. Everybody, what's the line from Les Mis? Everybody loves the landlord, right? Sorry. But they have to pay their bills too, right? Mortgages, property tax, utilities. So finding a landlord who wants to make housing not just a business but a mission is increasingly hard. But that's where church-based groups, nonprofit groups can pay the security deposit or even, sign a guarantee, right, to help. Because if a landlord says, I don't want to rent to you because you have kids or you have an eviction or a criminal record, right? If a trusted third party comes in and says, we're good for this, we're going to help guarantee the rent, right? I was talking to someone the other day who was helping resettle refugee families. Right? And they have no credit score. So the landlord's like, no, we're not going to rent, right? So there's like a bunch of people through a faith-based community who's like, we're going to actually sign the lease or be guarantors, right, that this person's good for and help them in. And that's what we're going to have. That's what a lot of nonprofits do to help get people into housing, right? Especially if you're a nonprofit that's also providing services, then you can help convince the landlord that this person is a good person, we're going to make sure that they're paying their bills on time and going to work, right? It just becomes increasingly hard. Okay, so a couple more data points and then we'll finish up. Homeownership rates in Wisconsin dropped, especially for younger households. That's the households headed by 25 to 34-year-old, right? Homeownership rates stayed the same pretty much for people over the age of 55, right? And again, this is the challenge we have. If you ignore your workforce, they'll go away, right? Because young people have options. I was talking to a student just yesterday, and she was looking at a job in another state that was going to be a pretty good job in her field, and is like, no, I can't afford to move there. There's no housing available, so why would I move to this interesting place with a good job if there's no housing available for me, right? And this is the issue, is young people, if they can't find a place to live, because eventually they're going to move into the homeownership demographic, they have options and might go other places. Okay, and here's where then we just have to name one of the most perverse and offensive truths of the state of Wisconsin. All right, you can't maybe read that, but the middle line is African American homeownership rates. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act in the United States. And nationwide, the black homeownership rate has increased or decreased since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. It's decreased, right? So nationwide, it's about 45, 46%. Wisconsin is 28.6%. We're the 6th worst state in the nation in terms of the black-white homeownership gap. 6th worst. You know who's ahead of us? North Dakota, South Dakota, Maine, right? That don't have significant urban and black population. So this is just, the black homeownership rate relative to the white homeownership rate is a moral failure and abysmal. 50 years after the Fair Housing Act. In Wisconsin, it's twice as bad, right? So this, I think, is the challenge to the faith community, right? We're not convinced government policy is going to try to actually do much about this. But we can, right? We talk about what are the strategies. Okay, a couple things on housing cost burden, and then we'll finish up with more questions. Wisconsin, amongst all Midwestern states, has the highest rate of homeowners who pay more than 50% of their income on housing. And again, this reflects both an older demographic and an older housing stock. Right? And this is a huge challenge for us. Most of us, when we think about affordability, are thinking about younger families with kids who are working and are renting. And that's totally true. And we should totally do lots about that. Right? But we have this emerging challenge that seniors are staying in the homes. They want to stay in their homes. This is a good thing, right? But the maintenance, upkeep, property taxes, utilities, and other homeowner costs are just inadequate relative to their income. And so in many ways they're stuck. They can't make repairs. They can't maintain the house, right? They call Andy and ask for assistance, and Andy has to say, there's no money in the bank for these programs. All right? And of course then, this is the big challenge. So I'm going to walk through this a little bit because it's a little bit complicated. In Wisconsin, currently, there are 146,000 households, so that's over 250,000 people, right? 250,000 people, whose income is less than half of the area median income, and they spend more than 50% of their income on housing. Right? If you think about people who are at most risk, most vulnerable, most at risk of either experiencing homelessness, housing insecurity, doubled up, these are our neighbors and friends. These are the people who clean our offices and cut our hair, and right? These are people who are working. They just don't earn enough to afford a decent quality place to live. And that's true everywhere in the state, but it's particularly severe in high-cost areas like Dane County. Right? And so this is the kind of overwhelming challenge that you all can strategize with Mark and Don about, that churches, synagogues, faith-based groups can try to meet. Right? And I always have to remind myself that when we talk about 146,000, that's just a big number, right? But we want to put faces to these numbers, right? These are real people whose income is less than half, so they're working, they're not earning enough to afford a decent place to live. So 50% of their income is spent on housing. That doesn't leave a lot for food, medicine, transportation, school books, right? And rent growth is slowing down, but it's still growing faster than 6% a year, right? So these households are going to continue to be impinged by high rent costs. So I'm just going to end kind of with this point, right? That in the Madison region now, so this is current, right? These are list rents. In the Madison region, a one-bedroom rent is $1,430. That's the median, half or above, half or below. Okay? My mortgage is a lot less than that. I would imagine most of you with a mortgage, it's less than that. All right? And a two-bedroom median rent is $1,700. But in Milwaukee, it's a two-bedroom median rent is $1,000. Okay? And I'll in the 15 minutes we have, then we'll do discussion. I'll just say, we're facing some significant challenges, right? Because we have a housing supply challenge. And we have a huge housing affordability challenge for low-income renters. We have huge racial disparities in housing cost burden and home ownership rate in the state. And then, of course, we have an aging population and an aging housing stock, right? So I just did a professor thing. I summarized the four. I told you there'd be four. So what are the four housing crises, right? Inadequate supply, both units and diversity of stock, different sizes, price points, right? Significant rental cost burden for low-income renters. Huge racial disparities, right? And older housing, right? And so every one of those might take a different challenge. These are all areas where faith communities and nonprofits can work, but there's inadequate resources, right, from various government sources. And here's where we just say that some of the emergency resources we had during COVID, the homeowner assistance funds, the emergency rentals funds, right? You know, Andy's been administering those with the state and the WISCAP agencies, doing tremendous work, getting the money out the door, but those resources are going away in the next month or two. And the need is not going away. In fact, you talk to anybody in the food pantry world, and they will tell you that visits are significantly up in the last month. And by the end of February, the kind of additional benefits within SNAP, additional eligibility funds are going away. So at least in terms of the most fundamental basic needs in this society, housing and food, right? I have to be honest. When I'm in my public policy data world, I'm really worried. Because needs are going up, resources are going away. And it's going to hit at absolutely the worst time, right? And here's where then, and I think we want to get into a discussion, which is, I live in the public policy world, and I have to get in trouble. I'm a state employee, so I'm not supposed to advocate for public policies. But I think I'm on pretty solid research ground, saying we need to all lobby for more resources, right? And the passage I showed earlier about sharing your bread with the hungry and welcoming the homeless, right? I think we can say, as an expression of our deepest values that we say we believe in this country, right? How we treat the poor and the extent of just structural racism and disparity is, it's not just bad policy, it's morally wrong, right? But the other challenge is going to be, if public policy doesn't surge to meet these needs, right, to what extent can and should we, through kind of voluntary church and synagogue-based efforts, address the needs of the most vulnerable? And I know that's why you're all here, to think about this. So those are my main data points. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion.
So what is the likelihood of a policy for rent-to-own housing? I personally feel fairly strongly about people being able to acquire some wealth, and
Yep.
you acquire wealth through owning a home, evidently.
Right, and so for the majority of us who don't have significant wealth in stocks or businesses, for most families that do have wealth, housing is that source of wealth. And if you look at the Federal Reserve data, it'll show you that the largest explanation of the difference between white wealth and black wealth is largely home ownership, right? And Dr. Andre Perry of the Brookings Institute I've been listening to a lot of his podcasts. He spoke at a conference, right? He's like, white wealth and home ownership helped send kids to college. That's me, right? And helped provide a way for people to start businesses. So you're absolutely right that we've decided in the United States that the primary means of wealth accumulation is home ownership. And since we've moved on that path, we need to make sure that more people have access to home ownership. So you said something like rent to own, and there's a lot of different structures that both government policy and nonprofits do, some of which are rent to own, some of which are down payment assistance programs, right? And the challenge is, A, all of these are underfunded. B, there's not many actual federal programs that work in this. And of course, C is a lot of rent to own programs have this consumer protection challenge, which is, in the past, we've had plenty of unscrupulous financial institutions that have set up rent to own, where in essence, you're paying an exorbitant interest rate. It's just hidden because of how it's structured. Now, the city of Madison has various down payment initiatives, right? You can talk to Julie Spears over there, right? There's a lot of programs that do work. There's a program in Dane County, completely voluntary, called Own It, Building Black Wealth. If you're interested, it takes donations and helps African-American families to pay for a down payment on a house. And I'm glad to put you in touch with Sarah Alvarado, right? And so there's all sorts of ways through, a small church could pool their resources and help invest in a program to help people with a down payment. Rent to own is a little troubling unless it's designed by a government or a nonprofit that has real mission commitment to helping households build wealth rather than strip wealth, right? So a lot of these things, if you're going to get into this, you need to know what you're doing, and that's why you have Don here, right? You need to know how everybody in a transaction gets paid, and we unfortunately have enough history where some of these have been exploitative or predatory. And here's where I stop and I say, we actually know what makes low and moderate income and minority home ownership work. Right? It's homebuyer education counseling, plus down payment assistance, plus post-purchase support in a neighborhood with stable or appreciating property values. Right? Which makes it harder in Milwaukee, where if I help you buy a house and the neighborhood property values are going to go down, if I'm the nonprofit or the government, I'm on the hook for that decline. Right? In Madison, it's different, but in Madison, you need $40,000 for a down payment. $60,000, $80,000, right?
So Kurt, you've talked a little bit about seniors staying in their housing and that, but can you kind of just broadly talk about the supply of ADA or supported housing and kind of the crisis of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. Not much of it at all. And that's an important thing to say, is one of the reasons why seniors are staying in their homes is there's nowhere for them to move to. Right? And whether you think about the gamut of independent living, where you might have some occasional visit for supportive services, all the way to full-on, intensive nursing home care, and then housing that has universal design, accessibility, grab bars, all of these issues that are a huge issue for seniors, and the ADRC talks about this a lot. Aging and Disability Resource Center here in Dane County. There's none of it, right? That's why one of the things I tell policymakers is, if you want seniors to move out of their 70s ranch-style house, to open that up to a younger family in the school district, you have to have somewhere for them to move to, and it has to be something that's worthwhile to move to. And I know, right, a lot of seniors if you've paid off your mortgage, your housing costs are pretty low. Nobody really wants to sell and then move, because moving's a pain, and then rent someplace, right? And I think as our population ages, this becomes if people want to age in place, we have to find a way to bring services to their house, right? And that is everything from, remodeling to allow single-story access, supportive services, health care. And right now, it doesn't exist. I mean, there's pockets of little things there, here and there, but, right? I mean, we're not building any condos for people to move into. I don't know about you, but as I start approaching my 60s, I'd love to live in a condo where I don't have to shovel and mow the lawn. Right? And then when I leave for a month to go to warm climates, I don't have to worry about getting fined for not shoveling, right? But also slips and falls and just kind of more social life built within it. So, here's where I would say that a lot of the early kind of retirement-focused living arrangements, we're actually nonprofits and churches building these sort of things, right? There's a lot of Lutheran retirement homes in Wisconsin. So again, where a faith community could say is, if the market and public policy are failing, is that something we want to step into to build and run various housing-related programs, mission first, right? But then as Don will explain, and I can explain to you, it's just really expensive to do that. Suppose a church decided we want to build a 50-unit building that's mostly accommodates people with disabilities and seniors and provide services. You're talking probably $14 million to build that building, plus the ongoing operating costs. I don't know about you, but not a lot of churches have $14 million sitting around, right? That's where you get creative and you bring in Don for the financing. But I'm not skipping you, I just want to give some, yeah.
I think this is probably our last question.
Could something like the old FHA 235 program work in today's world? This was a program where low-income families purchased a home. The federal government subsidized the interest rate on a declining basis as their income went up. Had experience with it in the 60s and 70s when it worked quite well.
Yes. Very rare to have someone know what the FHA 235 program is. Right, but we used to do this, right, which is if you have a commitment to home ownership, then you need to have programs like various FHA programs that help ensure low to moderate income people to be able to buy a home, right? And of course, if you know the history of the program, it ran into both inflation and the Vietnam War, which competed for resources in the late 60s, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot of examples in history of things that have worked, right? I mean, if you had a nonprofit-based group that was really focused on home ownership, it's either down payment assistance or interest rate write-downs. But that means up front, someone is fronting the money to reduce the cost, right? And it just at scale, it's a lot easier to have FHA do it than to have, just in general, the American social welfare policy is inadequate federal resources, and then the gaps are filled by ad hoc, fragmented, lots of nonprofits and churches, which is great. We love this, right? But you're filling gaps that actually shouldn't be there. I think we'll have to end it there.